Ancient Epic: The Self-Destruction of Athens. Topic: How Athens Lost the Peloponnesian War. Democracy's most costly mistake. They had the strongest navy. They controlled nearly 300 city-states, collecting immense amounts of gold and silver every year. They possessed the most enlightened democracy, where philosophy and art reached unprecedented heights. Yet, they destroyed themselves. This was not a mere military defeat. This was a political suicide that spanned nearly 3 decades. What turned Athens from the dominant power of the Mediterranean into a starving, besieged ruin? The answer doesn't lie in Sparta, but within Athens itself. It is the cruel truth about power, the ignorance of the masses, and the fundamental flaw of democracy when faced with prolonged warfare. We are not telling a battle story. We are investigating how a great civilization choked the life out of its own ideals. If you want to uncover the fatal weaknesses of ancient empires and delve into the deepest analyses of historical decisions, hit subscribe and turn on notifications immediately. The Ancient Epic community is the place for true historical investigators. Let's dissect the greatest war that completely changed the fate of Greece. The inevitable clash, the Peloponnesian War, was more than just Sparta against Athens. It was the unavoidable confrontation between two ideologies. On one side was the Delian League led by Athens: democracy, naval power, commerce, culture. Flexible, innovative, yet arrogant. On the other side was the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta: autocracy, land army, agriculture, discipline. Slow, cautious, but persistent. Everyone knew who was stronger at sea and who was stronger on land. The challenge was not to find the superior opponent, but to find which will would endure longer. Part 1. Pericles' strategy and the first cracks. The genius and the trap of the walls. Athens' initial strategy was a masterpiece by Pericles. He understood clearly. Athens could not defeat Sparta on land. Therefore, he devised the fortress strategy. What was the fortress strategy? It involved withdrawing the entire rural population of Attica behind the formidable long walls connecting Athens to its port, Piraeus. The farmlands were abandoned for the Spartan army to devastate. In return, Athens would use its superior navy to control trade routes, raid Peloponnesian coastal cities, and economically exhaust Sparta. This was a genius strategy. It turned Athens' naval advantage into its sole weapon, neutralizing Sparta's land power. The devastation within the walls. But this genius contained a terrible flaw: congestion. When tens of thousands of people from the countryside flooded the city, they lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. For the first time in its history, Athens was defeated not by the sword, but by a terrible plague, possibly typhoid or a form of hemorrhagic fever. Pericles, the creator of the strategy, was one of the first victims. Pericles' death was an irreparable disaster. It wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the loss of a disciplined vision. Pericles was the only one with enough authority to control the Athenian democratic masses. After him, Athenian democracy became a ship without a rudder, easily manipulated by demagogues. The rise of Cleon and the age of demagogues. As fear and despair mounted, the voice of reason quieted. Instead, Cleon, an ambitious and aggressive leather manufacturer, rose to prominence. Cleon was the embodiment of demagoguery. He had no military experience, but he had the loudest voice and the surest promises. He pushed for brutal, punitive policies against rebellious city-states. Under Cleon, democracy was no longer a place for discussion, to find what was right, but where the loudest and angriest sought to impose their will. This was the first crack. Part 2. The suicidal decision. The Sicilian disaster. The trap of unending greed. The brief period of peace, the Peace of Nicias, was merely the lull before the storm. But for Athens, peace was not enough. They always had to seek expansion to feed their war machine and maintain their reputation. And then, Sicily emerged, a distant, wealthy island, home to the powerful city of Syracuse. The Athenians were seduced by the promise of unlimited gold and power if they conquered it. This was a strategic madness. It violated Pericles' basic principle: never risk core resources. The key figure, Alcibiades. The driving force behind this expedition was Alcibiades, a military genius, handsome, wealthy, but utterly immoral. Alcibiades was a symbol of Athenian arrogance. He didn't just want victory, he wanted a spectacular, personal, and dangerous victory. He promised a Western empire that would elevate Athens to ultimate glory. The masses, captivated by Alcibiades, agreed to send a colossal fleet, the largest offensive force Athens had ever assembled. This was a gamble that put the entire future of Athens on the table. The horrific betrayal. Just before the fleet departed, a major religious scandal erupted involving Alcibiades. Instead of facing trial, Alcibiades fled to Sparta and became a strategic advisor to his own enemy. This is one of the greatest betrayals in history. In a highly secretive strategic meeting with the Spartans, Alcibiades advised them to, first, send elite Spartan troops to Sicily to aid Syracuse. Second, occupy a fortress near Athens, Delian, to establish a permanent base on Attic soil. Alcibiades' advice was a fatal double blow. It turned the Sicilian Expedition into a disaster and plunged Athens into a state of perpetual siege on its own land. The Syracuse disaster. The Athenian fleet arrived in Sicily but lacked decisive leadership. The Spartans arrived in time. The conflict dragged into a tiresome siege. The Athenian democratic masses, instead of retreating when faced with difficulties, continued to send more reinforcements, money, and warships. One wrong decision followed another, all driven by rigid honor and a refusal to accept reality. The result? The entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. Over 40,000 elite soldiers, sailors, and citizens were captured, starved, or sold into slavery. This was an irrecoverable loss in terms of manpower and morale. The Sicilian disaster destroyed Athens' military power, but it was their arrogance that ultimately ruined their will. If you are finding this content valuable, one click of your subscribe button will help Ancient Epic continue to shed light on these mysteries. Part 3. The Persian Intervention and Economic Exhaustion. The Siege from Delian. While Sicily was unfolding, the Spartans followed Alcibiades' advice and occupied Delian. This was an economic catastrophe. Previously, the Spartans only raided Attica for a few weeks each year. Now, they were there year-round. This meant, first, over 20,000 enslaved people working in the silver mines, a vital financial resource, escaped and joined Sparta. Second, all agricultural supply lines were cut off. Athens had to import all food through the port of Piraeus. Athens switched to an absolute war economy, using emergency reserves. The role of the outside empire. The Peloponnesian War was no longer just a Greek conflict. It became an international war when the great Persian Empire intervened. Persia, the perennial enemy of both Athens and Sparta, watched the war with interest. Seeing that Sparta was running out of funds to build a large fleet that could challenge Athens, Persia opened its coffers. Persian money was the deciding factor. It allowed Sparta to fund sailors and constantly build new ships. Although Athens had superior sailors, they were financially exhausted, while Sparta could endlessly pump money from the rival empire. The internal crisis. Desperation led to a political coup. For a brief period, Athenian democracy was overthrown by an oligarchy. Although democracy was quickly restored, the event showed how much faith in the government had collapsed. Athens's resilience was astonishing. They continued to fight, building new ships from their last reserves. But they were fighting against an army that never ran out of money, Sparta backed by Persia, and a mentally exhausted population. Part 4. The Final Battle and the Eternal Lesson. The Battle of Aegospotami. The moment of collapse. After years of weary fighting, the final battle took place at Aegospotami on the Hellespont Strait, Athens' vital grain supply route. The Spartans, under the talented leadership of Lysander, employed patience. He lured the Athenian fleet out daily, feigning retreat. The Athenians, exhausted and overconfident in their naval prowess, grew careless. On one fateful afternoon, as the Athenian sailors scattered on the shore searching for food, Lysander launched a surprise attack. The battle ended almost instantly. All 180 Athenian warships were captured or destroyed. Most sailors and generals were killed or executed. This was the ultimate defeat. Athens's food supply was cut off. The navy, the only component keeping the city alive, was gone. The unglorious end, no further siege was necessary. Lysander simply blockaded the port. Athens, starving and sick, had to surrender unconditionally. The terms of surrender were a humiliation. The long walls had to be demolished. The Spartan army marched into the city, and Athenian citizens, who had fought stubbornly for nearly 3 decades, watched as the symbol of their democracy and freedom was destroyed. The lasting lesson about democracy. Athens' downfall was the failure of unrestrained democracy in wartime. Athenian democracy failed not because it lacked talent. It had Pericles, Alcibiades, Nicias, but because its system could not maintain discipline and long-term vision. Mass persuasion. Demagogues like Cleon could drive disastrous strategies based on emotion, hatred, and false promises. Arrogance. The arrogance of the masses led to the Sicilian Expedition, a gamble that a cautious autocratic regime likely would have refused. Emotional reaction. When facing defeat, democracy did not retreat to preserve itself, but desperately tried to throw more futile resources into the disaster. Athens was not defeated by Sparta's absolute strength, but by a continuous string of poor decisions passed by mob mentality and unyielding arrogance. They fought to defend freedom, but in the process, they undermined the very reason and prudence that freedom demands. The Peloponnesian War is an eternal warning. Greatness does not guarantee survival. Even the highest ideals can be destroyed by the very people who claim to defend them. Athens' collapse is a great tragedy, but also an invaluable lesson. What do you think about Alcibiades' role? Could Athens have won if Pericles had lived longer? Comment below, share your thoughts, and join the historical debate with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the Ancient Epic channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our deep analyses of humanity's greatest legacies. See you in the next epic.